One other source of paralysis in Jesus' day that we would know little of, and this is where there's kind of a spin. It's a little different in Jesus' day than ours, but there's kind of an application that's the same. And this one is one we don't know about because of modern medicine. But in Jesus' day, a cause of paralysis often was syphilis, sexually transmitted disease, which when allowed to run its course has a number of ramifications, but if it's allowed to run its course untreated, can paralyze you. So maybe that's why this guy is paralyzed. Bottom line, relative to cause, as we're kind of getting into this story, we don't know why he's paralyzed. He just was. It might have been his fault. Might have been a sexually transmitted disease. Might not been his fault. Might be because of sin. Might be because he bought a cheap ladder. We don't know why he's paralyzed. But and this is where, some history and understanding some of the background here becomes interesting. While we don't know why this guy's paralyzed, that would not have stopped the people who lived in Capernaum, where this story happened, from thinking that they did know why. You know where I'm going with this one? Because the assumption in Capernaum, particularly among religious people, about any kind of sickness, disease, paralysis, or trouble that anybody's having was that it was God's judgment for sin, always. So if it was a sexually transmitted disease and now you're paralyzed, your life is a mess, well, that kind of connection is easier to make, and we're quick to talk about that. But quite frankly, if you fell off a ladder, the guy over here fell off a ladder and again paralyzed. If you got paralyzed, God must be ticked at you. I don't know what you did, but it must have been big. This was the thinking among the religious in Capernaum. I don't have time to develop it, but one of the miracles, the healing miracles that Jesus did often was he was among lepers. And remember what he did with lepers all the time? He kept touching them. And that was so wrong. You couldn't touch a leper, partly because that touching this sinful guy, and by the way, that's where I was going with that. To touch a leper gave you leprosy, but it also was a symbol of sin. If you got leprosy, you deserve it. That's the mentality. People who live in Capernaum use it as a symbolic way of thinking. I'm pretty sure they know why other people are suffering. I'll never forget, it was a little over a year ago. This is a little blip on the screen, and I love this guy sometimes. But Pat Robertson was in the news. He's a wonderful guy. Just don't talk so much. Anyway, I remember Ariel Sharon had a stroke, and Pat Robertson came on TV, and he was pretty sure he knew why he had a stroke. Pat Robertson lives in Capernaum. He knows why. This morning in the session, I talked to you about Job's three friends, who when Job was covered with boils and his life was a mess, we didn't go into the text. I'm going to assume you know enough about it to know that those three friends had all sorts of answers. At the end of the day, they had all sorts of reasons why Job was suffering. They knew. They're from Capernaum too. Even the disciples themselves, you remember this story, seeing a blind man one day asked Jesus, whose sin that this man should be blind? Was it his sin or maybe his parents' sin? Jesus said something that kind of blew him away because they were from Capernaum too. He said neither. Because their assumption was that there's a cause for his trouble, there's a cause for his paralysis, and we know what it is. Sin. All of which means that in addition to the physical pain and humiliation of paralysis, the person who is paralyzed ends up with this feeling that they somehow deserve it. So if you are a person, quite frankly, right now, who isn't physically paralyzed, because I don't see anybody here physically paralyzed, but maybe emotionally, spiritually, relationally, there's something in you that's really, really stuck. But if you live in Capernaum, where everybody kind of knows why, and they're real sure they know why, not only do you have the pain, this is brutal to me, not only do you have the pain of being paralyzed, you feel strangely guilty for it. You got a double whammy there. This is a bad thing. Question. Let's just talk about this guy. No, we're not going to talk about you or anybody here. Let's talk about this guy on the cot who's being lowered. And some people in Capernaum kind of figure, and they know why he's paralyzed, because of sin. Here's the question. Is this guy a sinner? Yes. Next question. Are you a sinner? Yes. Question. If people who are paralyzed physically, emotionally, spiritually, are paralyzed because of sin, how come we're still walking around? How come we can still function? No sin? Maybe our sin's not as bad as their sin? Sometimes, we wouldn't say this, but sometimes we do get this little inside assumption that ours must not be as bad as theirs, that if we're not paralyzed, if we're not stuck, whether it be physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, if we're not stuck, we're not sure what we're doing right, but we must be doing something right. Just like we're not real sure what you're doing wrong, we just know you must be doing something wrong. Because if you were doing it all right, you wouldn't be paralyzed. You wouldn't be stuck. Let me ask you again, is this guy a sinner? Yes. Just like me. And just like you. So what we need to do as a church, as believers, who are to be the light in the world, is get off our morally superior high horse and help the guy. If you have a paralyzed friend, if you have a paralyzed friend, if you have a paralyzed neighbor, there's a level at which you may know why they're paralyzed, and you might even be right. But here's the deal. It doesn't matter why they're paralyzed. They need somebody to get them to Jesus. He needs 4 friends. By the way, I think you know this is true. I hope you know this is true. It kind of ties into the thing I talked about in the early session about everybody goes into a cave once in a while. Everybody gets paralyzed from time to time. And you know, one of the like underlying prayers I kind of have going, Lord, if I ever get paralyzed, if I ever get stuck, if I ever get into one of those places where spiritually I just can't move, emotionally I just can't move, Lord, help me not have that happen in Capernaum. I don't want to be living around people. You know, churches are like you could go to a church just like Capernaum. I don't want to be paralyzed there. That's a bad place to be paralyzed because they'll know why. It's really weird. I don't know if I should tell you this story, but I will. This is several years ago, but our church, through our missions program, we began to get real involved in the AIDS project in Africa. And our people responded so incredibly wonderfully to that. But what was interesting was how from a few, and it is always that, isn't it? It's always this few, who rose up quite vocally about how in the world we could ever get involved in helping the AIDS epidemic in Africa because they deserve it. They deserve it because of their sin. And now part of that was an education needing an education because an awful lot of the people who are dying in Africa of AIDS are little children who were born with it and they didn't do a thing to get it. But the bottom line is this: it doesn't matter why they're paralyzed. They're paralyzed. And what they need is help. And it's just odd to me how often Christians don't automatically think that way. They don't. And I love my church. And it's a good church, but not everybody automatically thinks that way. Let's meet the 4 friends who bring this paralyzed guy. We don't know why he's paralyzed, to Jesus.